Hello, this is Stephen, and you're listening to Catholic versus Catholic.
So just tell the listeners, if you would please, a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and how you came to believe it.
My name's Stephen Heiner. I've been Catholic my entire life. I was raised that way by two very devout parents. I am a writer living in Paris, and I'm an American, which I suppose makes me a cliche. But I am here after having built businesses for the last decade, and I still continue to do that. But I'm enjoying more time writing and traveling, living on my favorite continent.
When did you first start believing in God, and what was that like for you, and what was your prayer life like at the age of reason or just before and after?
I can't say I can pinpoint the moment that I believed in God. I think it was something that I always believed in. I suppose I haven't really had a moment in which I've questioned God's existence from my earliest memories that I can recall. As far as the household goes, as time went on, the family rosary took on more members as there were more siblings. But in the beginning, as the oldest, it was just my parents and myself. And we definitely prayed before meals. We prayed in the morning. We prayed in the evening before I went to bed. And as I got older and I was able to say the rosary, then I was included in that. But we went to church not just on Sundays, but sometimes on Saturdays or on weekday evenings. I was the youngest altar server permitted. I was 6 when I was altar serving as an altar boy there in Singapore. And it's a very safe country. So if you can imagine a 6-year-old getting on a subway and taking a 30-minute ride to serve a Monday evening mass, that was a little bit of what my life was like in Singapore early on.
Wow. So you were raised in Singapore?
Until I was 9, yes.
Okay. Are you ethnically Singaporean?
Yes, although keep in mind Singapore has 4 national languages and is 70% ethnically Chinese. So from my mother's side, who's Chinese, born in Singapore, from before her family, they were all born in mainland China. So I'm half ethnically Chinese. The other half, my father is American, and our bloodlines go back to England, Ireland, and Alsace.
Can you talk a little bit? I know that you kept the faith your whole life, and that's amazing. That's a real grace, right? But can you talk a little bit about some of the low points where maybe you doubted, maybe you were scared, maybe you were angry at God, maybe you started to drift a little bit into sin, or at least dabbled with temptation? Can you talk a little bit about the dark years?
I think probably your greatest challenges are faced in your teenage years, right? You have your body's changing. You find out that girls are not made out of spiders anymore, and things other than Legos get your attention. I think for me that the challenge was that was happening at the same time that I discovered the disjunction between church teaching and ecumenical councils prior to Vatican II and after. And so it was a confusing time for me, not so much in the way of, let's say, doubting God, being angry at God, going into in great sin, but rather just a level of confusion with no real answers. I was at a boarding school with a very conservative Novus Ordo group, the Norbertines at St. Michael's Abbey down in Silverado, California. And I've got a lot of time for them insofar as they really radicalized me in my Catholicism. I went from your usual Catholic, whatever that means, to someone who really was interested in church history, the councils, liturgy, rubrics, everything around ceremonies. And it was because they inculcated that for me. At the same time, 2 years after I started with them, I started to read books about what had happened in Vatican II, and I was really stuck because here I had been given this formation from these conservative Novus Ordos, and yet here I was reading what Pius IX, Pius X, Pius XI, Pius XII, Vatican I, Council of Florence, Council of Trent had said, and I'm having to somewhat look in opposition. A Catholic shouldn't be put in the position where he or she is trying to figure out, well, is this Pope correct or is this Pope correct? That's highly irregular. So I think it was a dark time. There's a particular episode I often share in which I was one of, the 7 people going to a weekday Novus Ordo at my local parish. I was the youngest person by at least 40 years. And going up to communion, I would just do a quick genuflection and receive on the tongue. And one day after Mass, Father Doug, who had a ponytail, took the time to say, some people are using an outdated posture to receive communion. And I can't remember exactly what he said, because at this point my ears started throbbing. Like, oh my goodness, is Father going to call me out in front of the entire congregation during Mass? And so these people are, you're simply being disobedient, rude, disrespectful, etc. And I was thinking to myself, how is this possible? And as everyone dispersed after Mass, I held myself together as long as I could. And then I started crying right there in the pew, asking, how is it possible that genuflecting to receive communion is disrespectful? Or that same Father Doug would tell me in the confession that what I was saying was not a sin. It's like, oh, don't worry, that's not a sin anymore. And so the confusion of this person is supposed to be a representative of the Catholic Church and what Catholic teaching tells me, but he tells me that Catholic teaching is not valid. But that doesn't work in Catholicism. And so when you say confusing, difficult, challenging, it was more confusion than anything else, and not having anyone I could really turn to, because the conservative Norbertines would tell me, well, that's just how people have interpreted the council, and they would give the narrative of the imprisoned Pope and, it's just the bad American bishops. If he could do what he really wanted to, it would be Latin Mass everywhere and holiness everywhere.
Which Pope was that at the time?
That was JP2, probably, 1996. So that was the beginning of a journey, not just for me, but for my family, because my family had taken on some of the radicalization that the Norbertines had given me. For example, one of my sisters was an altar girl. And after coming back from St. Michael's and getting her to talk to some of the fathers there, she stopped. And we all started receiving communion on the tongue instead of communion in the hand. So eventually the reading and research around Vatican II and the liturgy led me to the traditional Latin Mass. And at the time in Orange County, there was a so-called indult Mass being offered by a priest who was ordained in the old times and in the old way. His name was Father Daniel Johnson. And Father Johnson offered the weekly indult Mass at St. Mary's by the Sea down in Huntington Beach, California. And I remember going, and I had spent so much time reading the traditional Mass text and just falling in love with it that I asked to serve. So for my very first traditional Mass, I didn't sit in the pew. I went and served Mass. Now, I made a couple mistakes in reciting the text at the appropriate times, but I was so crazy for this Mass that that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to serve. So my very first Mass, I was actually next to the priest serving. And that was pretty much it for me. I realized that there was this Mass that had been taken from me, even though I'd never known that it had been taken from me, and that even my conservative Novus Ordo Norbertines had hidden from me as well. And it started a chain of questioning with them and lots of excuses, mostly about how you have to have permission and it's a special thing. And my family, who at the time we had always been looking for the most conservative Novus Ordo church for us to go to, they said, okay, well, we'll go to this Latin Mass thing. My father was nostalgic for it. My mom had heard of it. My sisters had no clue. They were 15, 8, and 6. So they weren't necessarily having input into it. They were just going to go wherever we took them. And then after about a 3-month spell there, because I continued to keep reading and overcome objections, I decided to go to Mass with the Society of St. Pius X up in Arcadia, California. And that was a 3-month struggle to bring my mother along, because there's a struggle about, are they schismatic? Are they excommunicated? What does this mean? And it meant that I had to go and study canon law, which I had never done before, and explain that if one person is excommunicated, it doesn't excommunicate people who attend the Mass of people in that congregation. So I didn't know any of that before I had to investigate it. But after much persuasion, my mom came along, and that was pretty much where our family stayed for a long time, which you could say the Society of St. Pius X position, that the traditional Mass and sacraments is the only way to go. They're in an irregular situation with what they consider to be the authorities of the Catholic Church, and we just have to wait until something happens for the best. But in the meantime, we are going to hold on to these things.
That's their position, but are you firmly in the SSPX camp?
No. And my journey out of the SSPX into my current position started in 2007, 2008, somewhere along there. And I had started to write more. And one of the pitches I gave to Michael Matt, who runs a newspaper called The Remnant in the United States, I said, hey, there's a SSPX bishop coming to California soon to do confirmations. I could do a sit-down interview with him. You don't have to pay me the stipend if you allow me to simultaneously publish on my own website. And he said, okay, done. So I interviewed Bishop Tissier de Malaray. And during the interview, and I was recording on audio. That's how I was keeping track of it. He said, you haven't asked the important questions. And I said, I'm sorry, Your Excellency, which questions? He said, for example, that Benedict XVI is a heretic and that he continues to profess heresies. And I'm somewhat dumbstruck here. So this is one of the 4 bishops that Archbishop Lefebvre has consecrated. He's considered the most intellectual among the 4. He's got the theological chops among the 4 of them. He uses the term heretic to refer to Benedict XVI anywhere between 13 and 18 times. And I go home that night, I transcribe the audio, and he's off to Oregon the next day. I send him a fax of the printout. He then marks it up and sent it back to me because I didn't want to publish anything without his consent because I wanted cover for myself. He had crossed out heretic in every instance and changed it to professed heresies. Now, at the time, I thought, well, maybe this is some theological difference, but I realized rather quickly that there is no legal or actual difference between being a professor of heresies and heretic, right? And this was just a word trick that he used to make the language sound less harsh and indefinite. If someone has professed heresies, it doesn't mean they still profess heresies. However, in the text himself, he said he still professes them. He has not retracted them. So the interview comes out and is a blockbuster, and it gets the attention of people like Bishop Williamson, who reaches out to contact me. It gets me the ire of the SSPX United States District, who said, where did you get permission? And then I showed them Bishop Tissier's signature on the fax that I got back, and they got real quiet real quickly. And I think they went on to scold him instead of me. No one in the SSPX hierarchy had ever used this kind of language to refer to not since Archbishop Lefebvre used language regarding the Assisi event, saying that this was an apostasy, this was a terrible thing. So it was considered a big deal in a number of quarters, and it got me a lot of attention. It got me the ability to write for the Angelus magazine, and it got me more access because I had simply popped up out of nowhere. I was this person who self-appointed journalist to go around asking questions of clergy. And that became an avocation of sorts. I would go around and interview clergy, asking them questions that I had. I really didn't care in a certain sense if other people had these questions. I had these questions, and it turned out that a lot of people had the same questions. But having someone call who I considered to be the vicar of Jesus Christ on earth a heretic was a major change for me. And so what that led me to ask is it possible that this man is not the Pope? And what does the church teach about heretics holding the office of the papacy? And I tracked down Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio, which is a bull written by Paul IV. Paul IV foresaw a possibility of a heretic being elected, and he put specific safeguards in place to make sure that this is not possible legally speaking.
Which century did he write?
Let's say mid-1500s. And so the fact that a pope could foresee the possibility of a heretic sneaking in to a conclave and being elected, and him having to put out a papal bull saying, here's how he wouldn't be pope, because it's impossible for a heretic to be pope because he who is not of the body cannot be the head, channeling St. Robert Bellarmine. That means that he foresaw such a possibility and he guarded against it. So that established for me, the church has already said a heretic can't be pope. Cool. And then I had to say, well, how is it possible that these men act counter to our religion and are still the so-called heads of the religion? And you would also hear phrases from SSPX type saying the conciliar church. And I got one of the priests to say on the record that Benedict XVI is the head of the conciliar church and the head of the Catholic Church, which is also a heresy, right? There's no way for you to be the head of two different churches. I don't even know what that means. But this was this sort of mixed up theology, this idea that someone can be the head of some church that you totally reject, but also titularly the head of the Catholic Church, which you accept. So I very much consider the SSPX position the have your cake and eat it too, or have your pope and eat him too position. So I came to reject it, but that meant more canon law, more theology, more studying what theologians have said on these issues, and realizing, okay, these people can't possibly be popes because they are heretics. Heretics cannot accede to the papacy, so we're in an interregnum. And that's a dreadful feeling as a Catholic, because as Catholics, we have a gravitational pull towards the Holy Father, towards all things. I live in Europe now. I've been to Rome 3 or 4 times since I lived there as a student in the year 2000. And what's different for me now, as opposed to when I was a Novus Ordo visiting Rome, is I just have this sort of sad emptiness when I go to these beautiful churches of Christendom that I know that they're occupied by invaders who are actively working against the Catholic faith. And I simply, when I'm there, I say a quiet prayer that one day, if we deserve it, our Lord will set things right. But for the moment, this is very much what we deserve.
Are there any Sedevacantist priests, bishops, and cardinals close to the Pope?
Well, there are no, I mean, it could be secret as Sedevacantist cardinals, but no, the Sedevacantist clergy are fairly dispersed worldwide. And if you think about it logically, there is no principle of unity, because Sedevacantists argue that the Pope is the principle of unity. Therefore, if there is no Pope, there is no subordinate hierarchy and waiting.
Well, the 4 marks will always indicate the true church, right? What would you say about that? And what would you say about the 3 attributes of authority, infallibility, and indefectibility? Are they also off the table?
No, obviously you can't pick and choose Catholic teachings, but the idea of the visibility of the church is something I think we're influenced by as moderns, because we have the internet, we have video, we have news, we have access to things. But where was the visibility of the church in the catacombs? I mean, popes were getting killed left and right. Nobody knew who the Pope was at the time. Nobody knew where the church was. So I think the idea of quote unquote visibility literally is very different from the church teaching on visibility. Visibility doesn't mean he's available on TV or you know who he is. You think of the Japanese Catholics who were without priests for 200 years. They were born, baptized, lived, and died their lives. They didn't know who the Pope was. They didn't know where the church was. They had no priests. But for them, the church was still visible because they had the faith. The visibility of the church resides in those who have the faith, not necessarily in a living hierarchy at any given time. Keep in mind, every time that we have a pope die, all Catholics around the world have no pope. It doesn't mean the church is invisible.
No, but the church government is always intact. That's the point. Even if you're in the deepest jungle and unaware of who and where that government is, there is a government always.
Well, there's a principle of government. I mean, the church doesn't guarantee that all the bishops couldn't get wiped out. In fact, Pius XII had written up plans for what happens when something like, because they were talking about nuclear bombs and that kind of thing, if they were all assembled, what would happen. So the church doesn't guarantee that all the bishops couldn't be killed. The idea of the visibility of the church is that we will have it. Now, what makes that up is the faithful and the clergy in their differing degrees, whether they're subdeacons, deacons, priests, bishops, and obviously popes. But whether a pope is available at any given time doesn't speak to whether the church is visible or there is church government, because technically speaking, church government grinds to a halt when the pope dies, because there is no ordinary jurisdiction in place.
That's not what the church teaches. The church teaches that the whole body of the church and that hierarchy carries on business as usual during the interregnum.
Well, it's not quite business as usual.
There's no interruption in the church. That's what the church teaches.
Of course there's interruption insofar, well, when you say there's no interruption, obviously people are still getting baptized, people are still being ordained, etc.
The church doesn't disappear and reappear when a pope is elected, right? The church is there, the government is there, constantly and always. If you disagree, I'd love to hear your arguments.
I'm not saying that the church appears and disappears. In fact, I've been arguing directly against that. You asked what the visibility of the church was, and I said, well, the church is visible whether there's a pope around or not.
But the key point for me is government. There is a government during all the interregna. I was an atheist for my whole adult life for 25 years, a staunch enemy of Christianity in general and the Catholic Church in particular. And one of my favorite things to mock and ridicule, besides the Bible, was the history of the papacy. And I knew the dark and horrible and messy and ugly history of the papacy and the councils. I knew it. And I was reveling in the disgusting process by which they make the sausage. So when I entered into the Catholic Church, that was not an issue for me, distinguishing the baby from the bathwater. It seems to me that you have a naive notion of the Church where you think that the popes were all holy up until John the 23rd.
I've never said that. Not the entire time we've been discussing. I've never brought up the personal morality of the popes. Not once.
But you really don't think that I could find you a pope that was a material heretic?
You can go and do whatever you'd like. I have the evidence that a pope has issued a bull preventing a heretic from acceding to the office. It would also seem to make sense, since the gates of hell will not prevail against the Catholic Church, and this is a promise given to us by our Lord, that it would be impossible for a heretic to become the head of the Catholic Church. And as St. Robert Bellarmine clearly states, he who is not of the body cannot be the head. So this idea that, yes, there could have been a heretic, A, it's not true. That's just an assertion on your part. But secondly, it's not possible by Catholic teaching.
It wasn't an assertion, it was a question. Do you think that the worst popes in history were not material heretics?
No, I don't. And I think it was a question of a personal immorality. It was not a question of deviancy from the Catholic faith.
So your firm belief is that every single pope up until John the 23rd was fully Catholic in what they believed in terms of doctrine?
We don't have any evidence otherwise. And if you have evidence, I would love to see it.
I don't have evidence. I just have a very gritty purview on some of those medieval popes.
Oh, yeah. And absolutely. There was some, the Borgias, all of that, nothing nice about it. However, the idea, again, of personal morality, because this speaks to us as Catholics, we're all sinners. The Pope's not exempt from that. There's a question of personal moral turpitude versus a personal doctrinal deviancy. And there's no evidence to believe that. It also would fly in the face of Catholic teaching and common sense to believe that a heretic could be the head of the Catholic Church.
Just, if you don't mind, could you tell me why I should consider our current Pope a heretic?
Well, I can talk about Francis, but I want to set the stage for talking about Francis because it necessarily dovetails into Francis, Benedict, JP2, JP1, Paul VI, John the 23rd. So the question all revolves around Vatican II. Is Vatican II Catholic teaching or is it not? If it is, then my position is not tenable. And if Vatican II is not Catholic teaching, your position is not tenable. So let's look at the documents of Vatican II and examine them against what the Church teaches. And we look and we find in Vatican II all sorts of problems. I think the challenge is I had spent my entire life in the Novus Ordo Church, and I'd never read a single document of Vatican II until I started investigating this stuff. And when I did, I was horrified at what I read, partially because I had been radicalized by the Norbertines as to what Catholic teaching was. And I read what it said about ecumenism in direct contradiction to Pope Pius IX and Mortalium Animos. I would read stuff about collegiality, which is completely opposed to the Council of Trent. I would read things on religious liberty, again, opposed to Pope Pius XI's Quas Primas. When I cite these papal documents, 9.5 out of every 10 Novus Ordos that I run into, and I guess the 0.5 would be any hobbits, they've never heard of these encyclicals, even though they're not that old. And secondly, they don't know what those encyclicals say. Sometimes, too, they're poisoned by Americanism, this idea that separation of church and state is a positive good when it's been condemned by the church, specifically by Leo XIII. So Vatican II presents substantial departures from the Catholic faith. Therefore, it cannot be considered Catholic. Therefore, my position.
I have found contradictions among papal bulls, encyclicals, pre-1958.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I can find one and send it to you. I don't have it at the tip of my tongue.
My question is, if you said that papal bulls or encyclicals have contradicted themselves in the past, why wouldn't this bother you? This is a violation of Christ's promise.
Because there's a difference between God's eternal and unchanging truth and the very messy human affairs that permeate the church here on earth, the church in purgatory is being cleansed and the church in heaven is already pure. But here below, you have to understand that there's a lot of give and take. I could be reading the writings of a Freemason when I read official documents of the church. I don't know, right? You do acknowledge that there's always been infiltration in the Catholic Church, right?
Of course.
This is not neatly packaged away like, oh, the dirty parts are clearly indicated in red and all the holy, unchanging truths of God are in black.
Yes, but you're talking about individual books or individual people who have either been identified or not been identified. You're not talking about the church in an ecumenical council teaching, proposing things for the entire world. So the idea that disciplines can be changed and there's messy parts, absolutely there can be. But that doesn't have anything to do with doctrine.
But what I want from you is evidence that there's a contradiction between the dogmatic teachings of post-Vatican II church, this phony church as you would see it, and the true church, which was, I guess, publicly visible before 1958 and is now underground or something like that.
No, it's still visible again in the people and the hierarchy of those who are Catholic. So the sort of layup softball here would be religious liberty. Do you know what the church's teaching on religious liberty is?
No.
The only religion that has a right to exist is the Catholic religion that is given the ability to publicly exist. Any other religion may be tolerated for the public good because of political conditions in the country, because of certain cultural things. But none of those religions have the same rights as the Catholic Church. In Dignitatis Humanae, which is the contentious document around the council, this is directly contradicted. Now, what you have to look at and say is, well, Dignitatis Humanae is the only document ever to contradict anything prior said in the Catholic Church on this. So do I believe this one document from this one council or 1,960 years of Catholic teaching? That seems to be fairly obvious, and it's not simply one thing. We can go into the document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. We can go into the Mass itself as promulgated. 1969, when the first edition of the Missal came out, it had a heretical definition of the Mass inside the preface. And Paul VI had to issue a second edition right away, and he had to suppress the first edition with an orthodox definition of the Mass. So you have the teachings on religious liberty, on ecumenism, on collegiality. You have the Mass itself. Then since then, we've had the 1983 Code of Canon Law. We've had the John Paul II Catechism of the Catholic Church, all of which have teachings that are directly in contradiction. And so people like Benedict XVI have used the term hermeneutic of continuity in this idea of how does a Catholic hold these two oppositional ideas in mind, that you do have a right to profess a false religion and you don't have a right. The nice thing about Catholicism is you don't have to do stuff like that. 2 + 2 = 4. The Eucharist is the body of Christ. The Pope is the Pope. It's quite simple, Catholicism.
Has the post-Vatican II church said that the real presence is not the case?
Well, I mean, if we want to talk about how they treat it.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, has the church denied the real presence?
There has been a substantial change in the text of the Mass to question the validity of consecration of the Novus Ordo Mass, yes.
You question it, but I don't question it. Why should I question the validity of the consecration?
Well, I can't expect you to doubt something you haven't studied.
Yeah. I'm just looking for clues and tips and little starting points where I can find out if I belong to a false religion.
Sure. So if you take a look at the words of consecration within the Novus Ordo, they are set in a narrative tone. If you look at how the Mass is said, not just in the Roman Rite, but in every other rite of the Church, the Chaldean Rite, the Coptic Rite, the Armenian Rite, whatever Catholic branches exist, when you get to the words of consecration, they are set apart in bold from the narrative. And it's been clarified in church teaching, not just in Trent, but elsewhere, that if it's given in a narrative, it's this idea of a story. And we're all around here to have sort of some grape juice and bread. But the idea of set apart words of consecration are part of what lead to validity. So in the Catholic Mass, it says, hoc est in corpus meum. So this is my body. Those are the words of consecration. Nothing else are the words of consecration.
I don't understand what you said about the words of consecration. Could you just rephrase that or clarify that for me? This is my body.
Right, that's it. But that's not what it is in the Novus Ordo.
Sure it is.
No, in the Novus Ordo, it's this is my body which has been given up for you. It's hoc est enim corpus meum quod pro vobis tradetur. So they added some words that were not there before. And it's part of a narrative. It's not said in a different tone of voice. And again, the church has done all this before for a purpose. You can make changes as a pope. The pope has the ability to change the mass. That's not impossible. But the question is, are the changes invalidating? And what does that say if they are? You also have a change in the text of our Lord, right? So in English, and Benedict changed this. So if he hadn't changed it, it wouldn't be a concern, but he did change it, which says that it must have been a concern, which was a mistranslation of pro multis into for all. But this has been taught specifically by St. Thomas and other churches. Why is it for many? Are you clear on why it's for many and not for all in the words of consecration, apart from the fact that our Lord said for many, he didn't say for all?
He died for all, and many take advantage of that opportunity, right? So that's the subtle nuance, I think, that Sedevacantists get tripped up on.
It's not a subtle nuance. It's a church teaching that Christ did not die for all insofar as there are some who would reject him, and so Christ did not die for those people. It's for many. And again, you're talking about changing the words of our Lord, and you're talking about a mistranslation from the Latin, which is the official text anyway. So I don't care what the English says. The Latin says pro multis in the Novus Ordo. How do you translate pro multis into for all?
I don't go to Mass in English, so I don't hear what you're hearing. I go to Mass in Italian and I hear pro multis for the many. So I don't see how that's relevant. And the church is Jesus Christ, right? So to argue with the church is to argue with Jesus Christ. So it's kind of like the Seventh-day Adventists who say, well, look, obviously the Sabbath is on Saturday, therefore the Catholic Church is the whore of Babylon, right? You have to trust Jesus Christ. And to second guess Jesus Christ, I think, is a big mistake, to put it mildly.
Oh, no, I'm with you. You can't second guess the church and you can't second guess Jesus Christ. The question is, are these people the representatives of the church? And that's a simple question.
Would the real Catholic Church please stand up?
Well, it's certainly not a man who says there is no Catholic God.
Who said that?
Francis.
What did he mean by that?
He was being asked about how atheists can go to heaven. And he talks about, what kind of God there is. And his response was, there is no Catholic God.
Well, I don't believe that God is good, right? Because God is beyond good. This is the via negativa. So you can choose to interpret the via negativa as a denial of God's goodness. But if you're honest, you'll say, well, they're saying that he is beyond good. And
no, that's not what he said.
But what I'm doing is I'm giving the benefit of doubt to the Vicar of Christ on earth because he's the visible head of the church.
Who you consider to be the Vicar of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, this is the whole point of our discussion. And to take every opportunity to interpret things in a way that maligns our Pope's faith, I think is uncharitable to say the least. I'm not saying that's what you do, but I think that there are a lot of critics that are on the right politically that hate Pope Francis because he appears to be some sort of progressive.
So are they all delusional, or are they part of the media conspiracy against Francis, or might there be a problem with Francis?
There is a problem with Francis in as much as he's a sinner in need of a savior.
But it's not possible that he's a heretic, although you maintain that it's possible that one of the popes in the past was a material heretic.
I need to look into that. I mean, I prefer to think that no pope can be a heretic. I prefer to think that.
It's not a matter of your preference of thinking. It's not possible.
But I need to think about it and conform myself to Christ and his church, not the other way around. So I won't force the church to conform to my opinion. I will find out what I need to believe about heresy in the papacy. But as it is right now, I can see possibilities where you could have a material heretic prevented from teaching error concerning faith and morals, and that wouldn't disturb me in the slightest. Now, I also like your point of view where it's just impossible to be the head when you're not part of the body. That makes more sense to me. The problem is that I've read the history of the popes and I've had a very low opinion of many of them, not all of them, but a handful. So I need to reconcile that somehow. And if I can reconcile it, then certainly I can reconcile Francis.
But you're talking about two different things. Personal immorality as distinct from doctrinal infidelity. So a bishop, your bishop, whoever might be, he'll tell you this is what the Catholic Church teaches, and maybe privately he's sinning. It doesn't invalidate what the Catholic Church teaches, right? So by the same token, Alexander VI and people like him could have been horribly personally immoral, and it's a shame for all of us as Catholics that happened. But it doesn't change the fact that he never issued any heretical or questionable statements, didn't lead any of the right-wing political commentators of the time to question him. can someone who is not of the body be the head? No. As a doctor of the church has said, no, that's not possible. But secondly, what does this have to do with Vatican II? The question is Vatican II Catholic teaching? If it is, my position is not tenable. If Vatican II is not Catholic teaching, your position is not tenable. So the question I would pose to your listeners and to yourself, and what I posed to myself originally is, what does Vatican II teach? Well, you would only know if you read what Vatican II wrote, which most Catholics have not, and that's okay. They're long and boring and horrible. But you do need to read them and then compare them with texts written by previous popes that directly contradict it. And then ask yourself, how is this possible? And the Catholic answer is it's not. It's not possible for Catholic teaching to be contradictory. So how do I resolve it? Well, this must not be a Catholic council. And we've had pseudo-synods in the past. We've had anti-popes in church history. So I just don't believe the period of anti-popes have ended. If you've studied the popes and you've studied church history, you know we've had, I think, 57 or 60 anti-popes. It's been a long time since we've had any, but I would have to believe that they've ended.
Have we ever had a string of them for 60 years running?
No, we haven't. We have had a period in which we didn't have one for 3.5 years, and I think the only reason was the Italians removed the roof tiles of the house and started throwing things at the cardinals, and I think they finally made up their mind. But again, the church was without a pope for 3.5 years during that time period. There was also the Great Western Schism, which happened related to the country that I live in now, in which people were born, lived, and died with two bishops in their diocese, one who was tied to the Avignon papacy and one who was tied to the other claimant. And so where was the visibility of the church for them?
Yeah. How was that resolved?
The church resolved it by having those other ones go away and Martin V become the pope. Those people lived and died with confusion regarding the situation. You had St. Vincent Ferrer, a doctor of the church, backing one claimant, St. Catherine of Siena backing another. Times were confusing, but it doesn't mean that the visibility of the church was interrupted, to your point. So whether there's no pope or whether there's multiple claimants or whether there's anti-popes, the church government and the church itself are unaffected broadly. The church continues.
Yeah, I'm very happy if you belong to the true Catholic Church and I belong to a false church that's been taken over by Freemasons or whatever it is. If that's the case, I'm happy to accept it. I just don't happen to believe that. And the reason I don't believe it is because I don't see anything that you've said that really strikes at the heart of dogma. You've hinted that maybe there's something to do with religious liberty. Is there a quick way for me to verify that that is an established dogma? And is there a quick way for me to verify that post-Vatican II it was dogmatically defined in contradiction?
You are not, as a Catholic, only enjoined to believe the things that are only dogmas.
I know that.
You're also enjoined to believe things that are doctrines, etc.
Yeah.
So it doesn't need to necessarily have been a defined dogma, but it has been common Catholic teaching as outlined by previous papal encyclicals and by magisterial teaching. We didn't really see it until after the Peace of Westphalia because it wasn't an issue, because there wasn't any other religions other than the Catholic Church within Europe.
I'm surrounded by liberal people, and a lot of them are ostensibly Catholic, and they're pro-choice, they're pro-gay marriage, they're pro-women's ordination, and they consider themselves Catholic. I don't.
Hold on. Can I ask you why you don't?
Because that's not what the church teaches.
Correct. They don't become non-Catholic based on your opinion. They are non-Catholic because they don't accept it.
Yeah, it's all about Jesus Christ, who is God incarnate. So on the other extreme, we have people that are maybe more on the right and who are hardcore traditionalists, and they say that unless you stick to the old ways, you're part of a false church. Now, the way I like to think about it is that the left is looking to the future. There's actually a heretical Catholic movement called Future Church. I don't know if you've heard of it. They're looking to this future church where everything is rosy and the spirit of the age is lived fully and embraced by the church. The rad trads, I guess, is what they call the people on the right. They want to go to the church of the past. But what I want to do is I want to acknowledge the church of the present and follow and obey the church of the present, warts and all. So that's kind of my position in a nutshell.
Oh, and I think that's a neat position. I think it's true on the left, but I think it's a caricature of the right. Because when you say old ways, quote unquote, what does that mean? Does that mean incense?
What it means is that you're not listening to the church today. What you're doing is you're hearkening back to the good old days. Is there anyone further right than you?
Yes, there are conclavists, people who've elected their own pope. There's a schismatic, heretical sects.
That I would see as a comforting symptom that you're not the most radical.
No, I'm not. And again, this idea of the old ways, like, again, this is pick and choose Catholicism. You have to do what the church teaches. You have to do what the Holy Father asks. My fundamental disagreement with you is I do not accept these people as the Holy Father, and I do not accept these authorities as a church because they profess a faith that is substantially different from Catholicism, as evidenced by the documents and as evidenced by Catholic teaching. So as a quote-unquote Novus Ordo for most of my life, I would say there are plenty of people who, like yourself, are not aware of Vatican II's changes and do not know that they are in opposition to what the Catholic Church has always taught. And understandably, out of your gravitational pull, as all Catholics should have, to the Holy Father, if you think of him that way, your mind is entirely shaped by that. And I totally get that because I've been there. That was the beginning of the confusion. How is this possible? How is it that the Vicar of Jesus Christ on earth, et cetera, et cetera? But what cured this was research, conversation with priests and people that I trusted, and most importantly, prayer.
But is invincible ignorance a real thing?
Sure, of course it is. I mean, I didn't know about any of these things. I really didn't.
Could I ask you a favor to sort of try to find out quickly and briefly if I believe anything that is not Catholic? Okay,
sure. We can hit some of these teachings of Vatican II on religious liberty, that you have a right to practice a religion that is not the Catholic faith publicly. That is forbidden by the church, and it's outlined in the Syllabus of Errors by Pius IX.
I plead ignorance on that one. I would need to do some research, but I'd like to think that people are sincere when they're worshiping God, even if they're a Hindu.
We're not speaking to people's internal sincerity because that's impossible. We're simply talking about, do they have a right to exist publicly?
I think so. I don't want to shut down the Hindu temple.
I understand that, but that's contrary to Catholic teaching, as outlined. And as I said, you have to be careful because I think there's a sentiment that as Canadians and as Americans, we've been influenced by the way our countries are, but that's contrary to the church's teaching. We have lots and lots of evidence for that.
How would it be policed that? How would we shut down all these public...
No, there's not a question of shutting down, because the church says there are times in which this must be tolerated. Since Protestants and Catholics have had to live together, the church has had to deal with this issue. So it isn't a new issue. The question is, do they have a right? Meaning, can it be taken from them? Can a mosque be shut down? And the answer is yes, of course it can.
I often think about a sausage factory. You know, you're allowed a certain number of rat hairs and fecal matter. I think that I can tolerate that as long as the business owner is not purposely injecting rat hair and fecal matter into the sausages. Do you see the difference?
Sure, but you realize tolerance is a secondary virtue here to the faith.
Okay, I just have one other thing to say about religious liberty, which is that I tolerate my common cold. When I get a common cold, I tolerate it, but I also attack it with medicine and I go to the doctor, right? So I think that I see religion like that.
You're not really tolerating it because if you could banish it with a flick of your thumb, you would. So you're tolerating it as a prisoner.
Yeah, like in the classroom, should Johnny get a gold star for trying hard when he says 2 + 2 = 3? No, he shouldn't.
Right. And he should be sent to the principal's office if he tries to print up a banner saying that, right?
Yeah. So I think I'm fully on board with your worldview on that point.
Which would make you opposed to Vatican II's teaching on religious liberty.
Allegedly, according to you. I'll look into it.
I'm the only one in the conversation who's read the document on it. So I would just challenge you to read it. And again, I respect the fact that you are looking at all this.
What is the document?
Dignitatis Humanae.
Thank you. Next question for me. You have anything else you could ask me to find out if I'm Catholic?
Catholic stress test. The 1983 Code of Canon Law permits the reception of communion by non-Catholics under certain circumstances. This is forbidden by the Catholic Church.
That sounds offensive to me. How do they justify that?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm the best person to make the argument for the Novus Ordo, but they say that if a Protestant expresses desire for it and alignment with Catholic teaching on the Eucharist, that he or she can...
Oh yeah, well, I'm perfectly happy if a Protestant is Catholic. I'm perfectly happy to have him receiving communion.
I understand, but they're not saying that's not what the canon says. The canon says if a Protestant, ... So obviously, if someone's Because it sort of paints the scenario of like, who is this person? This is a fictional person. It's like the guy on the desert island. So this is a Protestant who's asking to receive communion, who believes the Catholic teaching on the Eucharist. It's like, well, why isn't he Catholic? Right? You're reading this canon. It makes no sense. However, that canon is offensive to Catholic teaching. And the fact that it exists in something promulgated by ostensibly the Vicar of Jesus Christ on earth, in which he cannot err when giving disciplines to the universal church. This would be the same thing for saints. That he cannot err. If he says that St. John Paul II is a saint, well, he can't err on that issue because he's proposing something for belief to Catholics. However, I know that John Paul II kissed the Quran, has received the mark of Shiva, has said all sorts of repulsive things in all of his encyclicals. He can't possibly be a saint. So these are all things you could say that are teachings of the Novus Ordo Church that flow from Vatican II, which are in opposition to my Catholic faith. So I then have to say, well, is this Catholicism or not? Well, I get to look back at 1,960 years of history, whereas the Vatican II popes only ever quote themselves. They pretend that nothing has existed prior. And again, to your point of the church of today, yeah, I would be fine with that narrative if it included any part of the church of before. But it doesn't. It pretends that those popes never existed. Vatican II is the super council, the super dogma of all time. And it's the only thing ever taught. And what the funny thing is, it's only taught as an idea. Catholics, again, have never read these documents because they're boring.
I have to disagree with you about the church not exposing us to pre-Vatican II councils and documents, because those are the only documents I am familiar with and the only ones I have read. Not that I've read them exhaustively.
Are you asked to read them from the sermons that you hear on Sunday, or did you do them on your own?
Just on my own.
So you're not receiving it from the people who are ostensibly pastors of the Catholic Church?
I don't get a lot of theology from the pulpit. It's more just talk about the readings and relate it to the people in the pews, and it's very simple.
Sure. Listen, you're in a country in which the bishop gives communion to Justin Trudeau, so I don't have a lot of confidence in the moral fortitude of the Canadian Catholic Church.
I'm firmly opposed to giving communion to Justin Trudeau or anyone else that's pro-choice.
So you know better than the bishops of Canada. I mean, again, doesn't this set up a disjunction for you?
No, because I belong to the Universal Catholic Church, and
but this is a matter of discipline. This isn't a matter of personal morality. The man is a heretic. He's not a practicing Catholic. You cannot. It is forbidden for a public heretic, someone like himself, to receive communion, and yet you have someone who has quote-unquote ordinary jurisdiction within the Canadian diocese, archdiocese, whatever it might be, of the Catholic Church, and he's disobeying a direct Catholic teaching.
I view that as a problem. I view that as a grave problem, and it's very disconcerting, but
He believes in a different religion than you do. So the question is, do you believe in the same religion that this Canadian bishop believes in or not?
My Catholicism is more like your Catholicism, probably. But the difference is that I submit to the church, even though it's full of...
Again, it's not a question of personal morality. It's a question of doctrinal deviancy. To give communion to someone who is publicly un-Catholic is forbidden by the church.
Okay, if you're telling me that my church teaches that it's okay for Justin Trudeau to receive communion, that I will run away from that, but I don't believe that.
The idea that I need to be able to read something and study something as a Catholic is false, because not everyone is at your level of literacy or your level of learning. The question has to be lowest common denominator, Joe Catholic in the pew, Jane Catholic in the pew, and what do they see? They see this. You can't say, oh, well, it didn't say this in this document, so you don't have to worry about it. Their faith, in the meantime, gets eroded while you're standing around waiting for evidence. But the problem is that your actions are, I don't remember what Saint said, preach the faith always, use words when necessary. This idea that your actions are completely, well, if he didn't say it, it doesn't count. Or if he didn't write it in a document somewhere, it doesn't count. It's like these people are acting in an apostatical manner. But for some reason, when someone has bishop's robes on, you say, well, I'm conforming to the hierarchy. It's like, well, there's no get out of jail free card for the hierarchy.
Do what they say, not what they do. There are plenty of people that are ostensibly in the Catholic hierarchy that I consider wolves in sheep's clothing, and I think Jesus Christ promised me that there would be weeds among the wheat until the very end. But I'm not deterred by the simple fact that they're obviously wolves in sheep's clothing. That is so painfully obvious to everyone, I think, in Novus Ordo. Have you met a Novus Ordo that denied that there are wolves in sheep's clothing in the hierarchy?
No, I have. I have met people who are big fans of Pope Francis and think that he's a breath of fresh air.
I like him and I love him and I pray for him and I respect him and I honor him. I don't trust him as a man. I trust his office that he will never teach error concerning faith and morals.
But he has taught error regarding annulments, divorce, and receiving communion. He's directly opposing Catholic teaching on this. Have you read Amoris Laetitia?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know that it's chapter 6 alone is directly contradictory to church teaching. And I'm not out on a limb here. There's this whole talk about a formal correction and Cardinal Burke and all these people. They're not from crazy land.
No.
So my question is it possible for someone who is not of the body to be the head? No, it's not. So if someone is a heretic, they cannot be the head of the Catholic Church. If this man is posing heresy as universal teaching, which Amoris Laetitia is, and then the Argentinian bishops issued a statement saying this is how divorced people can receive. And then Francis writes a letter saying there is no other interpretation other than the Argentinian bishops' interpretation. That is documentation of someone directly opposing the Catholic faith. And this man, apparently the head of the Catholic Church.
Okay, can we talk about this? Because I'm firmly opposed to giving communion to divorced and remarried.
Well, you're opposed to Pope Francis then. How dare you?
I read the document. Maybe it's because I have rose-colored glasses on, but I just chose to say, well, I don't understand it. You know, do you remember when St. Jerome translated the Bible and he encountered things he couldn't understand? He didn't say the Bible is wrong. He said it's infallible. I'm fallible, therefore I just can't grasp it. He famously said that, and I say the same thing with the church documents today.
But this has never happened before. You're talking about something it's never happened that a church document has come out. And I think the thing is, you may not have you read any encyclicals from any of the popes prior to John Paul II?
Yeah, I know they're clear and they're concise and there's no ambiguity. I know that, yes.
Because that's what Catholic teaching is. It's always been that way. That is a characteristic of Catholic teaching. And when you see things that are not, it means, probably not Catholic. Which means I don't have to adhere to them. And the question is, what does that mean? What are the consequences of that? If I don't adhere to that, is that just something I can pick and choose? You are picking and choosing what you can obey from Pope Francis. Pope Francis, and again, I'm using the term pope because that'll make it easier for your listeners, but I obviously do not consider him a pope. This guy says that it's okay to give communion to adulterers, homosexuals. I
firmly disagree.
That's fine for you to disagree, but who the heck are you to disagree with the Vicar of Jesus Christ on earth?
Aren't we allowed to correct the Pope?
You are not. You have no office to do so.
Really? Didn't St. Catherine of Siena correct the Pope?
No, she didn't correct the Pope. She advised him to move back to Rome. And by what authority would you correct the Vicar of Jesus Christ on earth? Because there are other bishops and cardinals who would oppose you. So you're right and they're all wrong.
Are you telling me that the church that I belong to is in favor of communion for divorce and remarriage?
I'm not telling. It is a fact. Go read any of the documents. Read Francis's letter to the Argentinian bishops. Read the letter of the Argentinian bishops. That does better than the simple actions of the Trudeau communion in which there is no accompanying document. I have documents on this issue for you. Not just Amoris Laetitia, but all the documents that have come out since. He went and he blessed, this happened the other day, I saw a video of this, he blessed an adulterous union of the Colombian president. Both the Colombian president and his so-called wife are in second marriages with each other, and he blessed their marriage. So do you not support the Vicar of Christ in blessing an adulterous union?
Of course not.
Well, who are you to oppose him?
I'm not willing to compromise truth or my faith.
The only thing that I'm a bit concerned about was something you said earlier on, which is, if I find out this is true, I'm not going to join you. I'm going to leave Christianity. I'm not asking anybody to join me. I'm not part of any team or any sect or any club. I'm Catholic. I believe in what the Catholic Church teaches. I would die before I would give up this faith. So what I would encourage you to do is have the same courage that brought you here to the first place, which was entering the Novus Ordo. You had to leave atheism. You had to encounter a lot of things. And I think that says a lot about your character, and it says a lot about your desire for truth. So I would say continue that journey and just say, maybe I didn't read everything I needed to before I got to this first place. So think of this as supplemental reading for your first round as opposed to reading for the exit, which is, I do not want you to head to atheism. It's, as G.K. Chesterton said, if it weren't for God, there would be no atheists.
I think you've misunderstood me. I will never be atheist. My conversion to God cannot be shaken by anything, ever. But if the Catholic Church has contradicted itself, then I consider Christianity to be a false religion. But you're saying that there's continuity and that...
I'm saying that those people are not, as we've had false councils in the church and we've had anti-popes in the church in the past. Those people were not the church. So that's what I'm saying is I'm proposing a similar situation. I'm not proposing anything new. So I would say that is not the Catholic Church contradicting himself. I'm saying that it's a false church trying to assert itself as the Catholic Church, and I've spotted it, and other people have spotted it. And I think if you do the research, I think you'll spot it as well, or at least you're going to see some big problems and you're going to ask questions.
The biggest red flag I got from you is when you denied unity. You said there is no more unity. That to me is untenable.
No, I didn't say that there's no more. I didn't say there's no more unity. Remember, unity and oneness and visibility, holiness, all relate again back to the faithful, the clergy, and the hierarchy, and that all still exists.
To be a pope, you need to be elected by cardinals, but to be a cardinal, you need to be created cardinal by a pope. So there's a chicken and the egg thing there. How do you deal with that when there is no pope?
So there's a couple positions on this. There is what they call the Sede-vacantist and the totalitaire. So the totalitaire believes that there will be some sort of miracle to deal with this issue. The Sede-vacantist, the people who believe in the thesis of Gerard de Laurier, believe that cardinals possess an administrative function which you can hold without being a cleric, right? And that's true. In the past, we've had cardinals or deacons, and you don't necessarily have to be a bishop to be a cardinal. So they fulfill both an administrative function and a clerical function. So they still have the administrative function. So they believe that all of these claimants are what we would consider pope-elects in the way that a president is a president-elect. They are in possession of a valid election, and once they become Catholic, they can accede to the papacy. But until they become Catholic, there is an obex, there is an obstacle to them obtaining the power. Same thing, the U.S. president, even though he's a president-elect, he doesn't become president. He puts his hand on the Bible and he takes the oath of office. Then he becomes president. So that's how it's resolved for those who adhere to the thesis.
At the end of my interviews, I always ask my guests to speak directly to the audience. So just to wrap up the interview, what would you say to anyone that might be out there listening now?
I think one of the most wonderful things about being Catholic is that it orients my entire world and it orients my universe. When good things happen, when bad things happen, when strange things happen, it all is within this universe, this creation that God has given us. And I think that when you see something beautiful that was created, there is a straight line that connects from this moment all the way back to the beginning of creation. And I know that my universe makes sense because it comes from a place of order. And so apart from Christianity, apart from the discussion that we've had today and what people might be interested in, this sort of larger question of why we're here and what we're doing, it all comes from this place of love, that God did not need us. God does not need us. He's doing this from a place of love, and that's staggering. And it helps keep us grateful, but it also, I think, helps put things in perspective, right? I told you before the show that I was suffering from a bit of a cough and a cold, and thankfully it didn't come out too much during our conversation today. But when you understand the beauty of creation, things like colds, coughs, sickness, setbacks at work, difficulties in relationships, challenges with your family, these all get put in perspective. And without that, I would understand it. It must be fairly dark to try to understand everything from a position of chaos. But everything has a place, an order, and a reason for existing, including yourself. And I challenge you as a listener to discover that.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.